Hi, I thought I'd take a few moments to talk to you about abstraction. When I hear people talk about abstraction, often they have very strong opinions about it. Often they say, oh, I love abstraction, or I just don't like it. And it's interesting when you talk to them about what it is they do or do not like, they're not really sure. They just don't understand it, I think, is the main thing. And it doesn't speak to them because they don't know what it's about, because they don't see anything that they can really identify with what their world is. And often what I think that they're really objecting to is the non-representational art, because it is just, to them, it's just shapes and colors, and they don't really see that as something that really they can relate to in their own life. But for me, when I talk about abstraction itself is something that is sort of based on something in the natural world, something that we would run across in our own lives, but then the artist has decided to select certain bits of that to communicate a message. So he looks for essential parts, or she would be studying, could be trees or people or any object. I mean, it could be something as simple as a teapot. But for us, the idea of communication, though, we always have to pick and choose what we are discussing or what we are showing on the canvas. Even in conversation, I might be sitting down trying to share something with someone about what they've learned in a class that they've taken, or a way that they feel when they wake up in the morning. Somehow when you're sharing some experience, we can't communicate everything that we're feeling or seeing. We pick and choose the essential parts that we think are most important to communicate our state of mind. And an artist does that. They choose what forms that they think convey their message. And so for people, and the human form has been very popular throughout the ages, and so we could even look at that as a starting point for this discussion. And when you look at abstraction is not just something that happened, say, in the 20th century. It's been going on for millennia, because you look back at ancient Egypt and you look at their figures. They have an eye that's looking at you from the profile, which is actually looking at you straight on. It's not the way a person's head actually looks. You have an eye like this, an oval shape on the side of their head. They're moving a certain way. Their forms are very kind of stiff and angular. It's very stylized, and it's a form that had lasted for many years. The ancient Egyptian art, that sort of stylized form, remained the same for a long period. But it was an abstraction. It isn't the way that Egyptians actually looked. And so we see early instances of that, and we also see that in African art as well. Abstraction, stylized forms that become almost a symbol of the human being, but that is an abstraction. And so then in what we would say more modern Western art, but still the 19th century, you look at France, say, and so you start looking at the academies and things, and there, even though it seems more realistic, where they're trying to capture the silkiness of hair, or the sort of velvety soft skin, or would be even the appearance of veins underneath the surface. So they're looking at a lot of realism and detail to a certain degree, but then when you look at the forms and the shapes of the humans, that they are actually idealized. So instead of every little curve and lump and bump on a person's face, it's all kind of created in such a way that it's velvety smooth and just a perfect tone. The face is simplified into a more beautiful oval shape. And so you can see that the artist has taken liberties to move a few steps away from actual reality to something that they want to convey. And if it's a goddess, or if it's a figure like Mary, they're trying to show, possibly through the stylized form, this sort of ideal female. They want the perfect face shape. They don't want the real face shape of a young woman who's sitting there in front of them modeling. And so we see that. And then as time went on, we saw people pushing back on that idea of this perfect forms and the realism, at least in the academy sense of it, which is actually an idealized, selected realism. We want your flesh to look very smooth and very perfect, but but appear to have blood vessels in it, but then it's not really the way it looks. So we see people reacting against that stylized form and start playing around with light and color and things. So we see the Impressionists start to play around with the surface and painting, and the act of the artist applying brushstrokes to the canvas is now not something that's hidden. It's something that is very much brought to the surface, and is actually part of the design of the painting, these dabs of color. But what they're doing is they're also fragmenting the planes and the shapes of the figures on the canvas. So you have dabs of yellows and pinks and blues and greens side by side. They're playing with the idea of the colors, how they interact with one another. And they're also playing with light effects, where certain times of day seem cooler or warmer, or certain surfaces react different ways with sunlight hitting them, or the coolness of the shadows. So all this is interplaying, but because they chose to not have a polished, beautifully silky surface like in times prior, they decided to allow those rough dabs of paint to just exist on the canvas. What it did was it started to break up that form in ways that your eye doesn't. Whenever I look at someone's, the side of their face, it's generally pretty smooth, but if you have like dabs of color, it suddenly breaks that up. It doesn't seem quite so smooth. So you have then that breaking of the form, even more so when you start looking at into the of the fauves like Henri Matisse, who decides to not segment it up into little facets and things like the dabs of paint for an impressionist, but instead he kind of flattens things and gives very bold outlines and kind of compresses things into a more flat surface. And he'll even throw in colors not related to the way light effects necessarily work, but maybe just a green strip down the front of the face because that's what he chose to do. Then we're stepping out a bit further away from realism as our eye perceives it. But with each one, it's an abstraction because it's based on something that was found in nature, but the artist then decides to change that to express something and starts to focus often more and more on essentials and less on this sort of extraneous detail that doesn't seem to communicate a particular idea that he or she needs to communicate. So you have the choice of subject matter set, and also in the way that you then paint it. And what are the elements that you choose to enhance, and what are the ones that you choose to sort of suppress within your composition? And then you move into, say, Cubism, where you have that fracturing and a faceted appearance, but now with very hard edges. We are playing around with seeing different views of a human at one time. So simultaneously on the same portrait, you may see the face looking at you, at least the eye straight on, but then you might have the nose turned in a profile view. They're trying to communicate something, so they're picking and choosing what details it is that they want to express for their message, or just to challenge you and make you think about the human form in many different ways, and to see the complexity, and maybe ask you a question like, who are you? Often whenever I look at a portrait, it seems very stiff and it doesn't really look like the person, because, well, when do we ever see someone sitting in the same position forever? I mean, it's just this pose that never ends. So some of the best portraits are ones that in reality, if you sat that person down, maybe doesn't quite look like them, because they don't normally have their face that way. Well, maybe they have half a smile, and maybe their eyes are slightly aren't as smiling as much as when they go into a full smile. So they start playing around with what are the features that actually seem to express them more. So you could be playing around with kind of mixing expressions on the same person, But, in reality, when you'd have them seated and say smile, they might not look even like themselves, because again, it's this fixed thing where there's certain characteristics about their eyes that you notice maybe when they aren't smiling. Maybe it's when they're just sitting there with a very placid look on their face. Maybe there's a certain beauty about their eyes that is what captivates you. But then it's also their smile. So so you're trying to put those things, those features that seem to speak to you, the painter, and communicate those. And so we're playing with reality by picking and choosing how we combine things and what we put them together. And so we could look also at even the forms in nature and decide what we pick and choose, whether it's hiking along and you have your sketchbook and you come across a little clump of ferns and you decide to sit yourself down there. You could sit there and spend all day trying to copy every little contour on those very complex leaves, or instead you might decide, what I like is the general sweep and the curve of the main stem that comes up. And so you first of all do that, and maybe then you add a few other, just hint at some of the lacy quality on some of these complex forms, enough to give the essence of what you want to communicate. And so maybe you just like that central spiral and you don't want to do the rest, and so you might just have a collection of those spirals, and that would be your expression of what a fern is for this particular sketch. And so that is an abstraction, is you've taken something from nature, it is something in reality, and you've abstracted it. You've decided to selectively choose details to express, and have then decided very consciously what ones you are then allowing to remain unexpressed. And so that is your you've chosen the essence, at least of this particular expression, what to put down on your canvas or your paper. And likewise with the painters, you have, the cubists decided what they wanted to express as far as the human form, and how to express that in the kind of angularity and the fragmented, planes and surfaces of their paintings. And so the interesting thing is, though, with abstraction, depending how far you step back and how many things you actually leave unexpressed in your painting, it can look very much like non-representational art. And so when we look at things, that's where, in some ways, it helps to know a title. I mean, it's so you understand where the artist was coming from and why they chose what they did. I mean, to enjoy the artwork, you don't necessarily have to know where it came from, but it does help inform you, and as far as the interpretations of some of the shapes. Now, a person could just decide to put a lot of Y and V forms on a canvas and have them, be kind of bold at the bottom and get smaller as they go to the top, and that would be it. Oh, I just like that shape, and so you put it down. Now, you could have a person who's going out in the woods and decides they want to draw a tree, and the large Y shape at the bottom could be the tree trunk branching off, and it could then go off into these other forms, and you might have a very similar painting, but the expression of what it is the artist was trying to say might be very different, or the motivation for using those particular forms might come from a very different place. So it's interesting then the end result and this idea of abstraction, whether it's something based in reality or just something from the artist's mind, composing things because they enjoy the shapes alone and the interaction of color. An artist is an artist, and so they like paint. So there are going to be some similarities as far as being very careful about forms and the way colors interact and things like that. But what's guiding their hand, there may be some varying degrees of sort of associations with nature in those paintings, and so that's where some abstraction comes from.